one summer night, I met a god in the dark woods of Maine. I'd like to say that what happened was no one's fault. But that's a load of horse shit. The truth is, I blame Myra for all of it. Well, 99.9% of it. It had been her idea to spend the week at her grandparents' cabin up in Maine. And I'd only agreed because I knew our relationship was on its last legs, guttering out with a slow and terrible finality. We'd been madly in love with one another for the first 2 years of our marriage, but the well had run dry all at once after I lost my job. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't. I spent years of my life slaving away for them. And as I'd explained to Myra, I hadn't been the only one laid off. A company restructuring almost always meant layoffs, although no one in upper management would be so crass as to use the word. No, they referred to layoffs as right-sizing, or realigning our resources, using the kind of corporate jargon that made you want to put a bullet through your own head. Convinced that I'd have no difficulty finding another job, I informed Myra that she had nothing to worry about. We would be fine, I said. That was a lie. Myra and I ended up needing to do our own restructuring. We moved out of our luxury condo in the South End and into a ramshackle apartment building next to BU, on a street populated by count 'em, three frat houses. And Alston wasn't nicknamed Rat City for no reason. At night, we could hear them rooting around in the dumpsters beside our bedroom. I once thought I saw one the size of a cat, dragging its pink, scaly tail behind it. Although Myra would never come right out and say it, I could read the accusation in her eyes easily enough. She'd backed a losing horse, and she would never let me forget it. So I said yes, even though Myra's family cabin was located deep in the woods of Maine and didn't have an AC unit, internet, or even a TV. Yes, even though coming up here meant that I'd have to take unpaid time off. Time I shouldn't have been taking off. Yes, because even though Myra didn't love me, even though she recoiled from my touch and never wanted to spend time together anymore, I still loved her. That's why 0.1% is my fault. I spent the whole day driving while Myra sat, silent and sullen, in the passenger seat beside me. By the time we made it to her cabin, I didn't even care about how swelteringly hot it was. I was more than ready to collapse into bed. The heat might have woken me up eventually anyways, but a deep, guttural scream jolted me awake first. In the first few moments before I remembered where I was, sheer terror dried out my mouth. My mind did one of those funny skip and hops, and I found myself remembering the hard-boiled detective novels I used to read as a kid. The ones that often depicted some attractive blonde menaced by a figure with a knife or a gun on their covers. Then the image dissolved as the scream repeated itself. Closer this time. I told myself it was just a fox or a fisher cat, but the dirty truth was that I didn't know. I was a city boy through and through. I'd never even gone camping before. Even so, I hesitated to wake up Myra. I could imagine perfectly well the mockery that she'd greet me with, if it did turn out to be simply a fox or a deer or a fisher cat, or whatever the fuck else tended to scream in the night. I knew all too well the sardonic smile that she'd turn on me, the one that told me there was nothing I could do anymore that would impress or surprise her. For Christ's sake, it can't be human screams. We're in the middle of the woods. But that thought wasn't exactly comforting. I suddenly remembered one of my old coworkers, Steve, who had been laid off around the same time as me. Always ready with a joke. Steve had a broad, freckled face and a scruffy beard. About 2 months after we'd both been laid off, I invited him out for drinks at the dive bar a couple of blocks down from our apartment. Our conversation had touched on some of our old coworkers, our manager, and then meandered around to Steve's upcoming camping trip to Crater Lake, Oregon. He planned on proposing to his longtime girlfriend there. By then, I'd had a little too much to drink, and the world spun gently around me like a carousel. I knew Myra would have a lecture waiting for me at home. "You promised you'd take care of me, Eddie," she'd say. "You promised me a house with a white picket fence and 2 kids and a Mercedes-Benz." So what do you think you're doing right now? Palling around with Steve when you should be talking to a recruiter? Never mind that I must have applied to over 100 jobs at this point, or that I'd actually heard back from a wealth management firm 2 days ago. Myra had turned her nose up at the annual salary, but I'd gone in for the interview anyway. No matter how much money I poured into our relationship, it was never enough. To distract myself from thinking about her, I asked Steve to tell me the craziest thing he'd ever encountered in the woods. So Steve told me about the time he and his 2 older brothers had decided to section hike the 100-mile wilderness area of the Appalachian Trail. They'd eventually made it to the Antlers campsite in the late afternoon, and hadn't seen a single other person nearby. Steve had been the first one up the next morning, and had therefore been the one to discover that someone else had visited them while they slept. Although, he admitted to me, it took him some time to understand exactly what he was seeing. "A body," said Steve. All the laughter fled from his face. We weren't too sure at first because it had been ripped apart." He made an incomprehensible hand gesture, but I didn't mind not asking for clarification. I didn't want clarification. The most recognizable part was her torso. Some sick bastard impaled it on the tree branches hanging right over our tent. Did they ever find him? The guy who did it? He downed the rest of his beer and belched. "No, but I'm telling you now, the scariest shit when you're out in the wilderness is other people. Bears, mountain lions, animals I get. People. People are crazy." The last few words came out in a slur. As he pushed his chair out, he bumped the table hard enough that his empty glass fell over and rolled off the table, shattering on the floor. No one in the darkened bar bothered to look around. "Excuse me." Now the memory of his words lodged a hard knot of fear in the pit of my stomach. Sweat ran down my forehead and back like oil. I told myself that we had nothing to worry about, that it was just a story that had happened to someone else. We weren't in the remote wilderness. We were in a cabin. If anything went wrong, we'd dial 911 and run for my Honda Civic. I told myself all of this. And then I reached out to Myra's side of the bed anyway, knowing that I was being stupid, but entirely unable to stop myself. My fingers met empty air. There was another scream outside. My internal temperature plummeted 20 degrees at the sound. Because I thought I could hear words in the scream now. Words that sounded awfully like my name. No thought was involved in what I did next. Because if I had been thinking, I would have gone for the gun cabinet or my phone. Instead, I ran from the bedroom, yanking the door open hard enough that it slammed against the wall and rebounded, and blundered down the hallway and straight into the living room couch. The impact of running into it forced me into a half-assed kind of somersault, and in the instant before my head slammed down hard onto the wooden floor, I had time to think, this is going to hurt. And it did. The pain was enormous and all-encompassing. I couldn't do anything other than lie there in silent agony, both hands pressed to the back of my head. I was half convinced that my skull had split open, and that my brains were leaking out onto the shitty oriental rug Myra's grandmother had chosen for the living room. I curled into the fetal position and waited for the pain to subside. I might have stayed down there for the rest of the night. But just then, the scream sounded again. This time, it was unquestionably my name. But the voice. As the scream continued, it changed, becoming a rubbed, raw shriek that was impossibly loud. Something that no human or any other ordinary animal should have been able to produce. Mercifully, it lasted only for a few seconds. If I'd had to listen to it for longer than that, it would have driven me insane. As it was, it startled me badly enough that I sprawled back down onto my ass, and barely avoided rapping my head against the wooden floor a second time. Carefully, moving like an old man in my 70s, I hobbled towards where I thought the light switch might be. I badly needed those hard fluorescent lights on. At the same time, I thought of Myra out there, stumbling around in a dark wood, and unable to find the straight way out. But what kept intruding on this image was her smile. Not the one she used to give me, back when we'd both been seniors at BC, her majoring in English Lit and I finance, but the one she'd learned to wield as a weapon these past few years. when it became clear I was unlikely to work at any prestigious investment bank again. That little quirk to the right side of her mouth that said, more clearly than if she'd bothered to utter the words aloud, "You're a failure." Hand halfway to the light switch, I paused. Yes, I was a failure. I'd failed to achieve the lucrative career in finance that I'd promised Myra. I'd failed to be the kind of man she could remain in love with. But was I going to be the gutless coward she'd always accused me of being? Was I seriously contemplating leaving my wife out there, possibly dying or already dead, while I cowered in the cabin until sunrise? I took a deep, bracing breath and flipped the lights on. Even though they made my eyes water and the pounding in my head worse, I felt better already. Braver. I went back to the bedroom for my phone. I'd forgotten we had no reception here, and briefly considered attempting to bash open the padlock to the gun cabinet. As far as I knew, Myra's grandparents still had the key. But could I even operate a gun in my current state? I kept seeing double of everything, and I thought it more likely that I'd blow my own head off, or Myra's. Some rescue that would be. Without giving myself enough time to think about what I was doing, I grabbed one of the pokers lying by the unused fireplace, shoved the front door of the cabin open, and stepped out into the night. It was almost unbearably hot and humid outside, and the still air smothered me in its embrace. More importantly, it was too quiet. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. Nothing else stirred or made a sound. All I could hear was my own harsh, uneven breathing, and my skin crawled with unease. "Myra?" I shouted. "Myra!" I took another 5 steps forward before some craven instinct, the instinct of self-preservation, brought me to a halt. I stood there, sweating like a stuck pig, the poker in my trembling hand tracing figure eights in the air. The silence spun out like shattered glass. I realized that with all the lights in the cabin on, and my back to them, I might as well have pinned a paper target to myself. It was too easy to imagine some psychopath standing only a few feet away, knife or gun in hand, ready to drag me kicking and screaming into the darkness. The woods grew thick and wild all around me, alive with malevolence. The idea of charging in there, armed with nothing more than a poker, was as absurd as telling a child he could stop an 18-wheeler by charging it with a crayon. Call it what it is, I thought, sickened and ashamed of myself and still unable to move any further. She was right. You are a coward. You couldn't even admit the truth to her. But she knew anyway. You weren't laid off, you were fired. You... "Myra?" I said once more, without any conviction at all. But there was an answer. Something moved in the woods. Something massive. It remained outside of the circle of lights cast from the cabin, so I couldn't quite make it out. But I sensed a vast movement 30 feet or so beyond me. Countless branches and twigs snapped around whatever it was, and I knew with chilling certainty that it had noticed me, that it was coming towards me. "Oh, whistle and I'll come to you, my lad," I thought nonsensically, a half-remembered fragment from some novel floating through my mind. And then I was backing up, moving jerkily like a marionette, my eyes fixed unseeingly on the dark trees. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a bang. I started, dropping the poker, and turned around to see Myra standing in the narrow window to the left of the front door. Her dark hair rose in a cloud around her face, and she gazed back at me calmly. She was fully dressed and had a smudge of dirt along her left cheekbone. It took only one single, terrible second to comprehend what had happened. And then I was running for the door, banging on it in a frenzy. A harsh, rasping noise filled the night air and grew steadily louder, steadily closer. "Open the door," I shouted. She shook her head, and I attempted to ram it again. Pain exploded through my right shoulder, in perfect counterpoint to the throbbing in my head. Myra never even moved. She didn't speak. Her dark brown eyes were filled with a steely resolve I'd never glimpsed before. And of course, there was a steady contempt in them, too. Rage and resentment swept over me in a red tide. I slammed my hand against the window, willing Myra to look at me. She couldn't do this to me. For the love of God, Myra, don't fucking leave me out here. If only I hadn't dropped the fucking poker. I imagined using it to smash open the living room window. Imagined snatching up the car keys I'd carelessly dropped on the kitchen counter. I imagined driving away from here, and towards the sane lights of civilization. But going for the poker now would require turning around, facing the thing from the woods, facing whatever was so awful it had caused Myra to finally look away from the window. It was very close now. A terrible stench accompanied it. The fetid smell of rotting meat. I retched, blindly hoping that if I just stayed still it wouldn't notice me, that it would leave me be. In a near-perfect imitation of my own voice, it said, "For the love of God." The terror inside of me reached a fever pitch. Only one coherent thought made it through the fuzzy static in my mind, and it was that I didn't want to die like this. Cowering against the cabin like a dog that had been beaten too many times. Nearly insane with fear, I let go of the doorknob I had been futilely yanking on, and I turned around. Even now, I can't fully describe what I saw. The lights from the cabin illuminated only so much. What I do remember is that it towered high above me, on two disjointed hind legs, and that its eyes were a lambent yellow. They glowed like furnaces inside its inhuman skull. And on its head, impossibly, it carried a massive forest of antlers nearly double its height. They had grown interlocked with one another, twisting and weaving into a nearly solid bone-white mass, and reaching up to the unforgiving moon. Impaled on their sharp points were mutilated, eyeless human heads, their bloody mouths caught in silent screams. They twitched and struggled on the points, like fish wriggling on hooks. As I stared into the eyes of the thing from the woods, my fear drained away from me. An odd sense of familiarity replaced it, as though I had unexpectedly stumbled upon an old friend whom I had fallen out of touch with, miles away from where we had first met each other. I know you, I thought, and finally understood. I'd felt the dark woods all around me, the clawing tree branches and the blind eyes in the undergrowth. Had felt it from the moment Myra fell out of love with me. When it lowered its head and charged, I didn't bother going for the fireplace poker lying a few feet away from me. I simply knelt and waited. I woke up at dawn to find myself lying on the ground in the middle of the woods. I didn't recognize my surroundings, and neither Myra nor her family's cabin were anywhere in sight. I got to my feet wearily, full of disbelief at the fact of my own survival. Every joint in my body ached, and my head hurt worse than ever. I closed my eyes and remembered being flung into the air like a rag doll, remembered screaming in agony as blood poured out of me. The memory brought a fresh twinge of pain, and I looked down at the series of deep punctures that had been gouged in my chest and torso. I should have been dead. My hands crept to the back of my head, and found a vertical slit there, about 2 inches wide. The ragged edges of my skin fluttered along its edges, and I allowed my fingertips to gingerly explore the inside of the split. Something was growing there, like the roots of a tree. A tree that would grow in time to become a forest. Slowly, I started to make my way towards the cabin. I couldn't say how I knew where it was, only that I did, even though I wouldn't have been able to find my way to it yesterday. I thought vaguely of migratory birds. Birds that knew with unerring sense the exact location they were born. And then the thought floated out of my grasp and dissolved. It was getting hard to remember the hows and whys of the world, and even harder to hold on to my sense of self. So, I turned my attention back to the matter at hand. I was certain of two things. Firstly, that I would reach the cabin before sundown. Second, that my darling wife would still be there. Too exhausted from staying up late last night to contemplate driving back yet. I couldn't wait to see her again. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGrupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.